Hello everyone, and welcome to the Q-Man channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Predator Badlands 2025. The desert sun beat down with a relentless fury, mirroring the tension gripping the small, disparate group hunkered near the rusting remains of some forgotten industrial complex. This desolate stretch, far from any recognized jurisdiction, had become an unwilling arena. Our protagonist, Jax, a former Delta Force operative whose career had ended less with a bang and more with a classified career-ending incident in the South China Sea, now scraped by running high-risk security details. He possessed the weary competence of a man who had seen too much and cared too little, yet his instincts remained razor-sharp, honed by years under pressure. Opposite him stood Dr. Lena Hansen, an astrobiologist whose quiet intensity belied her radical theories about exoplanetary biology. Lena wasn't seeking fame. Her driving force was the validation of her unconventional research, often dismissed by mainstream science, research that had led her, perhaps foolishly, to track anomalous energy signatures deep into this forbidden territory. Her quiet presence was a stark contrast to the muscle Jax brought to the team. The catalyst for their current misery arrived not in tanks or infantry, but with chilling stealth. The creature, a predator, or yautja as Lena tentatively whispered, was less a brute and more a phantom hunter. It moved through the scrubland with an unnerving grace, its camouflage rendering it almost invisible against the heat haze. This wasn't the lumbering beast of early encounters. This iteration seemed faster, smarter, employing tactics that suggested a profound understanding of its prey's psychology. Jax immediately recognized the signature movements, the sudden shifts in weight, the way the air seemed to warp just before an attack. He thought back to his instructors at Bragg, the emphasis on situational awareness. Now, awareness wasn't enough. He barked orders, shoving Lena toward the relative cover of a collapsed pipeline. His weapon handling, practiced endlessly in the dead hours after his discharge, was fluid. Practiced survival distilled into muscle memory. The first direct engagement was brutal. The Predator disabled their main communications array with a precision strike from its plasma caster, a sound like superheated air tearing reality. Jax managed to draw its attention, forcing it into a visible engagement for a crucial few seconds. He caught a glimpse of the mandibles, the ritualistic armor, the sheer alienness of it striking him even through the haze of combat adrenaline. Lena, meanwhile, was frantically setting up a specialized sensor array. Her inspiration, she often confided to her empty lab late at night, came from Nikola Tesla's later, marginalized work, the idea of resonant frequencies manipulating matter. She believed the creature's cloaking mechanism relied on a specific energy band. If she could flood the local atmosphere with the inverse frequency, she hoped to disrupt its cloaking entirely, turning the hunter visible, vulnerable. The middle section of their ordeal became a desperate game of cat and mouse across the Badlands. Jax, utilizing his knowledge of improvised explosives and counter-ambush tactics honed during his less-than-honorable exit from service, kept the creature perpetually off balance, but at a cost. He took hits, superficial plasma burns that still seared deep, and a nasty gash from a retractable wrist blade. Each injury seemed only to sharpen the predator's focus. It wasn't just hunting. It was studying them, learning their limits. There was a moment when the hunter paused, its trioptic visor fixed on Jax's battered form. It seemed to analyze the sheer stubborn refusal to die. For Jax, that moment of appraisal was terrifying. It suggested the creature recognized him as a worthy specimen, not just a meal. As the sun began its long descent, painting the sky in lurid oranges and bruised purples, Lena got her chance. With Jax drawing the hunter close to the central clearing, she activated her array. A high-pitched, almost subsonic whine permeated the air. The shimmer around the predator flickered violently, then vanished. It stood there, fully visible, its biomask steaming slightly in the cooling air, momentarily disoriented by the sudden energetic feedback. This was the opening Jax had been waiting for. He abandoned his rifle, drawing a pair of combat knives he'd carried since his early deployments, tools requiring absolute intimacy with the target. He moved low, not engaging the plasma weapon, but aiming for the physical threat. Lena screamed encouragement, her scientific detachment momentarily fractured by primal fear and hope. The ensuing close-quarters fight was desperate, a chaotic ballet of cutting edges and armored impacts. Jax, fueled by pure, desperate willpower, managed to slip beneath the creature's guard, driving one blade deep into an exposed joint in its shoulder plating. The predator shrieked, a sound that vibrated in the bone and swung wildly. Lena, seeing the fight turning against Jax again, did the only thing she could think of. She overloaded the primary capacitor on her emitter, aiming the resulting energy burst directly at the downed creature. The resulting discharge wasn't elegant science, it was raw, uncontrolled energy. It struck the predator just as Jax braced for a killing blow, frying the creature's internal systems in a brilliant flash of blue light. Silence returned to the Badlands, heavy and absolute, broken only by the ragged breathing of the survivors. Jax stood over the smoking remains, his body screaming in protest, the adrenaline receding to leave behind exhaustion. Lena approached cautiously, looking at the grotesque yet undeniably dead trophy of their unlikely partnership. They had survived not through superior firepower, but through a strange confluence of brute force honed by military discipline and radical scientific insight applied at the very last second. They were leaving the wasteland changed, bound by the shared, unbelievable secret of what hunted in the shadows of the new frontier. Jax leaned heavily against the scorched shell of a transformer, the metallic tang of ozone mixing with the acrid smell of burned alien biomass. His lungs burned with every shallow breath, the pain in his side radiating outward from the superficial plasma wound. He looked down at his hands, slick with sweat and something darker, and felt a familiar emptiness settle over him. This wasn't the cleanup job he'd signed up for. This was a raw, ugly fight for existence that stripped away any professional veneer he still clung to. He remembered the detached precision required in his last operational tour, where every casualty was a statistical outcome. Here, every near miss felt like a personal failure echoing the disaster that ended his service. The feeling of being seconds too slow, of miscalculating a variable that cost lives. That ghost, the one from the South China Sea, had spurred him to take this suicidal escort job, a need to prove his instincts hadn't rusted entirely. Lena, momentarily forgetting her scientific reserve, was trembling as she examined the neutralized remains with a pair of heavy-duty polarized goggles. Her face, usually pale from long hours under artificial light in sterile labs, was flushed crimson with exertion and shock. She ran a gloved finger over the creature's armor, not with clinical detachment, but with a touch that held a mixture of horror and profound vindication. Her peers back at the university, the ones who laughed at her theories about energy harmonics and non-visible spectrum hunters, suddenly seemed very far away, very small. This validation, paid for in blood and sheer terror, tasted unexpectedly bitter. She had anticipated discovery, not annihilation. Her inspiration, that deep dive into fringe physics, had been sound, but the reality of weaponizing that knowledge against a genuine apex predator was terrifyingly immediate. As the heat began to dissipate, revealing the hard, unforgiving contours of the Badlands under the rising moon, the silence was thick with unspoken accusations and acknowledgments. Jax looked at Lena, seeing not just a scientist, but a survivor who had just witnessed the absolute limits of theoretical physics applied in a life-or-death scenario. He noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she toggled off her sensor array, a beautiful, terrifying piece of jury-rigged tech that had saved them both. He supposed they were both fundamentally broken people, he by the military machine that discarded him, and she by a relentless pursuit of truths the world wasn't ready for. "It was learning us," Jax rasped, his throat dry. He wasn't asking a question. It was a statement born from the primal dread of having been catalogued and understood by an enemy. He felt a wave of nausea, realizing how close the creature had come to finishing its study. Lena nodded, her voice steadying slightly as the scientist reasserted control over the terrified woman. "Its weapon signature matched energy absorption patterns I've only seen modeled in advanced kinetic shielding theory. It adapts faster than any biological entity I've ever processed data on. Your resilience, Jax, that pure stubborn refusal to yield, that was the variable it couldn't immediately compute." She looked at the ruined emitter, the source of their salvation and near suicide. "We were both playing outside the established rulebook today." They spent the next hour moving away from the site, avoiding the temptation to linger. Jax salvaged what functioning gear he could, the heavy weight of the Predator's discarded wrist gauntlet feeling strangely significant in his grasp. A trophy he wasn't sure he wanted but couldn't leave behind. The experience hadn't healed the old wounds, but it had cauterized the new ones with an overwhelming, shared trauma. As they finally reached the prearranged extraction point miles away, the rising desert wind seemed to carry away the lingering scent of alien blood, leaving behind only the vast, cold indifference of the landscape, a landscape now irrevocably tainted by the knowledge that some hunters operate far outside the jurisdiction of man, or even known science. They didn't speak of the future, only the immediate necessity of survival, carrying the secret of the Badlands hunt like a shared invisible shrapnel embedded deep within them. The extraction vehicle, a heavily modified, windowless armored personnel carrier piloted by a taciturn former associate of Jack's named Mac, a man whose loyalty was measured strictly in untraceable currency, arrived precisely on time, a testament to Jax's meticulous planning even when facing the impossible. Mac's face, usually obscured by shadow in the cab, was grim as he surveyed the state of his passengers. He was a former military logistics specialist who specialized in disappearing things, cargo, people, and inconvenient truths. He'd seen Jax through several close calls, but the sheer, raw exhaustion radiating off the pair tonight was new. He didn't ask. Mac understood that silence was the only appropriate currency in the immediate aftermath of true horror. As they pulled away, the Badlands receded, turning into a monotonous ribbon of pale dirt under the vehicle's powerful lamps. Lena, curled against the bulkhead, finally allowed herself a small, involuntary shudder. She closed her eyes, trying to erase the image of the creature's skeletal silhouette against the twilight, but the memory was too sharp, too visceral. Her professional life, centered on peer review and theoretical modeling, felt suddenly flimsy, a delicate spiderweb torn apart by a giant, invisible hand. She thought about the notes she managed to save, the hard drives containing the critical frequency data. Those were the true spoils of war. The physical evidence of the encounter could be explained away as military testing gone wrong, but the data was undeniable proof of something beyond Earth's current understanding, something that actively hunted it. Jack sat opposite her, his back rigid, methodically stripping the remaining weapon components and stowing them in separate, shielded containers. He was already compartmentalizing, building new mental walls around the experience. The confrontation hadn't brought him peace. It had merely redefined the scale of threats he was prepared for. He realized with a chilling certainty that his early retirement hadn't been a punishment. It had been a temporary reassignment to a lower threat level. Now, he was back in the deep end. He glanced at Lena, noting the shift in her demeanor. The terror was being metabolized into fierce determination. She was no longer just a scientist. She was a combatant, forged in necessity. Mac broke the prolonged silence, his voice a low rumble that vibrated slightly through the floor plating. "Clean drop point in Tucson, then you two split. I've erased the immediate telemetry signature from this zone. Nobody knows you were out here, unless you tell them. He emphasized the last point, not as a threat, but as a practical assessment of their mutual jeopardy. Tucson works, Jax confirmed, his voice regaining some of its old gravelly authority. He tapped the armored plating where the creature's shriek had nearly fractured the casing. He understood Mac's offer completely. The world they returned to would require careful navigation. They couldn't go to official channels. The structure that had once defined his life would only seek to classify, dissect, or weaponize what they had encountered, likely eliminating the witnesses in the process. Lena opened her eyes, meeting Jax's gaze with an unnerving clarity. "The frequency data goes with me," she stated, clutching a small, ruggedized satellite uplink case to her chest. "The world needs to know the parameters of the threat, not just that a monster exists. If we sanitize this entirely, another team, less prepared, will walk into the same trap." Jax considered this. Lena's need for dissemination clashed fundamentally with his ingrained survival protocol. Deny, disappear, survive. Yet, he had seen the creature's terrifying learning curve. Allowing the knowledge to be completely suppressed felt like aiding the enemy's continued success. He nodded slowly, a rare moment of concession. "You take the data. I take the silence. We both disappear until we figure out who is hunting what and why they brought this thing to our desert. Until then, we are ghosts." The pact was sealed not with a handshake, but with the shared knowledge of the alien predator lurking just beyond the visible spectrum, a new terrifying obsession settling over both the soldier and the scholar. The transition from the raw, chaotic environment of the Badlands to the clinical anonymity of Tucson was jarring. Mac deposited them at a prearranged, unmarked warehouse district near the outskirts of the city, just as the first, faint, hopeful rays of dawn touched the horizon. The air here smelled of exhaust fumes and stale industrial dust, a mundane perfume Jax found almost comforting after the metallic stench of the kill site. Mac didn't wait for thanks. He simply accepted the heavy duffel bag Jax pushed across the passenger seat, a payment stuffed with laundered currency, and executed a smooth, almost supernatural U-turn, vanishing back into the urban sprawl as if he had never been there. Lena stepped out of the APC stiffly, her limbs protesting the sudden cessation of adrenaline. The movement felt alien now, like piloting a very tired, very battered machine. She walked towards a discreetly parked, older model sedan, the one Jax had arranged for her onward travel, a vehicle nondescript enough to fade into any parking lot. She clutched the data case so tightly her knuckles were white, the weight of the encrypted information feeling heavier than any physical armor. The scientist in her was already wrestling with the implications of what she needed to do next. Disseminate the findings while ensuring her own survival against unknown forces that might prefer the truth remain buried alongside the Yucha corpse. She thought of her mentor, Professor Alistair Reed, a man whose early support for her unconventional research had been the only thing keeping her afloat in the academic sea. She needed to contact him, but the risk of exposing him was immense. Jax watched her for a moment, the rising sun glinting briefly off the dark, opaque lenses of the protective glasses he now wore, hiding the haunted look in his eyes. He saw the resolve hardening in her posture, recognizing the transformation. She had stepped onto the field an academic chasing spectral signatures. She was leaving a covert operative fighting for informational survival. "The car has basic tracing scramblers," he said, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the early morning stillness. "Change vehicles every time you stop for more than an hour. Don't use your primary comms for anything sensitive. If you feel eyes on you, don't check them. Drive until the air smells different." He didn't offer comfort. He offered doctrine. It was the language he understood, the structure that kept the chaos at bay. His own immediate future was simpler, yet infinitely more dangerous. He needed to secure the physical evidence. The Predator's remains, or what little they could safely remove, needed to vanish. Jax knew exactly which black market salvagers and deep cover extraction specialists to engage, men who asked no questions and had zero loyalty to national boundaries. His network, built during those murky years when he was officially unaccounted for between deployments, was about to be activated. He pulled a heavy, insulated containment unit from the APC's rear compartment. Inside, wrapped in specialized dampening foil, was the primary piece of trophy and evidence: the creature's wrist-mounted plasma caster, thankfully disabled by Lena's final energy surge, but still undeniably alien technology. As he secured the unit in his own, smaller transport waiting nearby, a souped-up off-road vehicle built for speed and discretion, Jax felt a flicker of something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but perhaps grim purpose. He wasn't just covering tracks, he was preparing for the next inevitable encounter. If the predator species was actively hunting across Earth's hidden sectors, then the fight wasn't over. It was merely relocating to the shadows where men like Jax and women like Lena thrived on the margins. They had won the battle, but the war, against an opponent that valued intelligent conflict above all else, was just beginning to unfold in the quiet corners of the world. They were now united, not by friendship, but by the terrible shared knowledge that their respective pasts had perfectly prepared them for a future they never knew existed. Jax drove his newly acquired vehicle, a matte black truck that swallowed light, away from the outskirts of Tucson, heading eastward toward the desolate stretch of Nevada border country he called home base. A network of abandoned mine shafts and decommissioned communication relays. The plasma caster sat secured in the rear compartment, a silent, heavy promise of future conflict. He kept his speed deliberately high but not reckless, utilizing the truck's superior suspension to glide over the imperfect asphalt, his mind running complex threat assessments on the very act of transporting the alien hardware. Every passing car was scrutinized. Every infrequent police cruiser was noted for its model and cruising pattern. His training, designed for countering human adversaries operating within known geopolitical boundaries, was now being warped to accommodate an enemy that recognized no boundaries, whose technology rendered conventional surveillance obsolete. He allowed himself one brief, necessary indulgence, contacting his most trusted contact, a former signals intelligence analyst named Silas, now running a high-end data laundering service out of a fortified farmhouse. The communication was entirely encrypted, routed through 3 different sovereign nations and bounced off a decades-old satellite uplink Silas maintained purely for paranoia's sake. Assets secured. Need deep scrub on regional satellite metadata for the last 72 hours, focusing on electromagnetic distortion spikes near coordinates Delta 9 or 70. Jax transmitted in a clipped code, omitting all identifying keywords. Silas's response was immediate and concise. Running the sieve. Expect noise filter by sundown. Price doubles for alien residue. Jax simply confirmed the overcharge. He knew Silas wouldn't ask, but the price reflected the severity of the contamination. Meanwhile, Lena was already miles away, heading south toward the Mexican border and a pre-arranged safe house near a small, obscure research facility she once funded anonymously. The sedan felt flimsy and exposed. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she expected to see the telltale shimmer of the hunter's camouflage, or worse, the aggressive profile of a corporate or government asset tasked with sweeping up the evidence. She pulled out the satellite uplink case again, her fingers tracing the hardened casing. Her primary goal was to find Professor Reed, not just for scientific collaboration, but for insulation. Reed possessed the necessary influence and reputation to lend credibility to her findings, to perhaps even frame the encounter as an unprecedented atmospheric anomaly rather than an invasion. But the betrayal of trust if she brought this danger near him gnawed at her conscience. She prided herself on minimizing collateral damage, a principle learned from watching the hubris of colleagues who chased notoriety. This encounter was anything but honorable. It was a desperate scramble in the dirt. She stopped at a roadside diner whose parking lot was mostly empty, save for a few long-haul trucks. The waitress, a woman whose face looked permanently etched by fatigue, poured her coffee without preamble. Lena sat in a booth near the back, placing the data case discreetly under the table. As she sipped the bitter, hot liquid, she ran a mental simulation. If the Yautja were studying them, cataloging their adaptations, what would they extrapolate from her sudden shift from theoretical physicist to emergency field technician? They would understand the mathematics of her weapon better than most of the scientists who funded her work. That chilling thought spurred her into action. She pulled out a burner phone and composed a terse, coded message to read. Resonance confirmed. Need immediate, untraceable rendezvous. Bring shielding. She hit send before she could second-guess the decision, knowing that by invoking his name, she had just pulled one of the few people she respected directly into the crosshairs of an interstellar predator. The coffee tasted like ash, but the small, defiant act of reaching out felt like reclaiming a piece of her agency in a world that had just proven itself terrifyingly larger and more hostile than she ever imagined. Jax felt the familiar, comforting chill of isolation settle over him as he reached his Nevada staging ground. The entrance, cleverly concealed behind a collapsing false wall in an abandoned molybdenum mine shaft, required a sequence of environmental cues, specific air pressure fluctuations and a particular acoustic resonance caused by kicking a loose piece of shale, to reveal the reinforced steel door. It was a level of operational security that made government installations look like open invitations. He parked the truck inside the cavernous main chamber, the darkness instantly enveloping the vehicle, save for the green glow of the dashboard instruments. The plasma caster, still carefully wrapped, was the priority. He wheeled it into the main laboratory bay, a bizarrely high-tech cleanroom built years ago by a defunct DARPA offshoot, now repurposed for Jax's eclectic collection of salvaged and necessary gear. He began the tedious, deliberate process of disassembly, not to understand the weapon's alien engineering, which was far beyond his current scope, but to render it inert and conceal its components individually across multiple, geographically separated caches. Each screw, each plasma conduit, was bagged, tagged, and placed into a container lined with materials designed to mask its energy signature from even the most sophisticated electromagnetic scans. This was the soldier's way. Never leave a traceable signature behind. The fight had concluded, but the evidence, the proof of the conflict, had to be rendered invisible to the institutions he actively avoided. As he worked, the exhaustion finally began to claw its way past the adrenaline reserves. He caught his reflection in a highly polished steel workbench. A gaunt, hard-featured man whose eyes held the hollow look of someone who had spent too long staring into the void. He thought again of Lena, her determination both admirable and dangerously naive. He respected her drive. He recognized the academic's need for validation paralleled his own need for atonement. But her decision to engage her professor felt like dropping a flare in the dark. Silas would run the scrub, but corporate or government cleanup crews operated on different timelines, often utilizing methods Jax couldn't counter with brute force alone. Later that evening, after the last component of the weapon was secured, Silas's confirmation pinged on a secure terminal. Metadata clean. No obvious external sweeps registered near the delta coordinates. However, the message continued, highlighting a single anomaly. A low-orbit military reconnaissance drone, operating under commercial classification, performed an unscheduled, low-altitude pass over the southern edge of the range exactly 12 minutes after your final transmission, before diverting to a standard patrol route. It lingered just long enough to collect significant background radiation readings. Someone noticed the energy spike, Jax. They just aren't sure what caused it yet. Jax leaned back, rubbing the grit from his temples. A near miss. The Yautja had inadvertently drawn in terrestrial watchers. This complicated Lena's plan immensely. If she contacted Reed now, they might be walking into a pre-established surveillance net waiting for an unusual event to manifest. The fight hadn't just been against the alien hunter, it was now against the bureaucratic and military apparatus of his own species, hungry to possess what they couldn't comprehend. He pulled up the coordinates for Lena's expected rendezvous zone, a remote corner of the Arizona desert that bordered an old, mostly abandoned observatory complex. He couldn't let her walk into a trap, not when she held the only key to understanding the enemy's language. His need for isolation warred fiercely with the unwanted, inconvenient obligation he felt toward the woman who had dared to shine a light on the darkness he had tried so hard to keep buried. He knew his next move. He had to intercept her before the official hunters arrived, turning the desert into a second, more dangerous battlefield. Jax didn't bother with sleep. Rest was a vulnerability he couldn't afford when operating on borrowed time. By pre-dawn, he was back in the lightless truck, retracing his route south, deliberately taking winding, unmapped service roads that only his deep local knowledge could navigate. He maintained a constant low-grade paranoia, the kind that keeps you alive when you are the only thing standing between a secret and the hungry machinery of the state. His destination was the observatory complex in Arizona, a structure perched on a high mesa that, ironically, had been abandoned because its isolation proved too costly for regular maintenance, making it the perfect dead zone for covert meetings. Lena, having received Silas's general warning about elevated surveillance, had already accelerated her timeline. She recognized the danger of lingering in one place. Professor Reed, a man whose intellect was legendary but whose operational awareness was notoriously thin, had agreed to meet near the old observatory site, suggesting the remote location offered the best chance for a private discussion regarding the anomalous readings. Lena felt the weight of her deception pressing down on her. She was bringing the apocalypse to Reed's doorstep, all in the name of academic honesty. As she approached the Mesa turnoff, the sedan felt increasingly flimsy, a paper envelope carrying explosive secrets. She had to ditch it. She pulled into the shadow of a massive sun-bleached billboard advertising long-defunct mining equipment, killed the engine, and quickly transferred the crucial data case and her meager belongings to a pre-stashed backpack. She looked back at the car, her last tether to a normal life, and felt a pang of real regret. Normalcy was a luxury no longer available to her. It was there, under the harsh glare of the morning sun reflecting off the flat desert expanse, that Jax found her. He didn't announce his arrival with a horn or a bright flash. The truck simply materialized out of the heat haze, pulling up silently 20 yards behind her. Lena spun around, her hand instinctively reaching for the canister of military-grade pepper spray she kept clipped to her belt, only to recognize the silhouette of Jax's imposing frame. "You're early," Jax stated, stepping out of the truck. He surveyed the area with a practiced sweep, cataloging the natural cover, noting the way the light played across the ridgeline. "And you're compromised. You're using the wrong route indicators for a simple meeting." Lena bristled slightly at the critique, but the edge was gone from her voice. "I got Silas's alert. I recognized the threat profile. Professor Reed isn't the issue. The observers waiting for him are. Did you run the same assessment?" "I'm running the counter-assessment now," Jax countered, walking toward her but never taking his eyes off the high ground. "This rendezvous point is too obvious. It's a known point of interest for amateur astronomers and conspiracy theorists. If the military sent a drone, they've already got satellites pointed here." He looked down at the data case she held. "We have to move the discussion point. Now." He pointed towards the far side of the mesa, a section riddled with deep, shadowed ravines. "We go offline. No comms, no digital trail. We use the old service tunnels beneath the observatory. They're shielded enough to keep a standard microwave scan guessing for a few hours." Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing the risk of trusting Jax's instincts against the certainty of being caught by whatever terrestrial force was converging on the beacon she had unwittingly created. Jax, sensing the internal conflict, offered a rare, curt piece of assurance. "The hunter taught me about patience." Now let's teach the earthbound ones about misdirection. Move. Together, they moved with an unnatural synergy, the soldier providing the tactical cover, the scientist providing the critical information, both unified by the terrifying knowledge that they were now fugitives guarding a secret large enough to change humanity's place in the cosmos. As they disappeared into the rugged shadow of the mesa, Jax took the lead, his heavy combat boots kicking up plumes of fine, ancient dust, readying himself to fight men who hunted with paperwork and surveillance. A fight almost as surreal as the one they had just survived. The descent into the abandoned observatory tunnels was a passage from the familiar desolation of the desert surface into an older, colder kind of confinement. The air instantly grew damp and heavy, smelling strongly of oxidized metal and stagnant groundwater. Jax moved with the silence of a predator, his headlamp carving a narrow, functional beam through the absolute blackness. He moved not like a man navigating ruins, but like a ghost charting familiar territory. His gait was economical, every placement of his weight calculated to avoid creating unnecessary sound or disturbing loose scree that might signal their presence to anything listening above, or anything already lurking below. Lena followed close behind, the backpack chafing her shoulders, the data case a cold, hard presence against her spine. The claustrophobia was intense, a physical pressure mirroring the psychological one. She kept recalling the creature's fluid movements, the way it occupied space without friction, and felt intensely clumsy in the tight confines of the service corridor. She was keenly aware that Jax wasn't just protecting her from external threats. He was imposing structure on her panic. Every time she stumbled or hesitated, his shadow would momentarily pause, an unspoken demand for focus. This wasn't an academic pursuit anymore. This was applied survival, and Jax was the reluctant, highly effective tutor. They reached the central maintenance hub, a large circular chamber designed for telescope calibration, now reduced to crumbling concrete and exposed rebar. Jax pointed his light at a large, rusted hatch set into the floor. This leads to the old communication conduit network. Deepest point here. We set up the decryption array there. We'll have maybe 4 hours before the satellite sweeps Silas-mentioned filters down to ground-level thermal signatures. As Jax expertly worked the heavy manual release on the hatch, Lena finally voiced the concern that had been simmering since Tucson. Jax, why are you doing this? You disappear for a reason. Protecting me means exposing yourself to every agency that tracks you. If they find the creature, they'll want to know who found it first. Jax paused, his hands resting on the cold metal. He didn't turn around immediately. When he finally did, his expression, partially visible in the reflected beam, was unreadable, hardened by shadow. The reason I disappear is because I knew there were things out there that the brass couldn't categorize or control. I saw what happens when the rules of engagement dissolve. The predator is a known variable now, a tangible threat that operates outside our mess. The people chasing us, the ones looking for the drone anomaly, they operate within the mess. They'll weaponize it, cover it up, and then blame the collateral damage on us. He met her gaze, his own eyes unexpectedly direct. I don't want another ghost on my ledger, Lena. You saw the thing clearly. You have the blueprint to fight it. I'm just securing the perimeter so you can finish the job. It wasn't altruism. It was a soldier's grim commitment to ensuring a necessary weapon, the knowledge, wasn't destroyed by lesser threats before the real war began. They dropped into the conduit network, a maze of defunct fiber optic lines and echoing pipes. Lena immediately set up her specialized gear, the only light in the chamber coming from the faint operational glow of the decryption hardware. She needed speed, but she also needed flawless execution. As she began routing the alien frequency data through the custom shielding, Jax took up a defensive position near the entrance hatch, his back pressed against the cold stone, listening not for the familiar sounds of human pursuit, but for any anomaly in the deep, pervasive silence of the earth. They were waiting for Professor Reed, a necessary piece of the puzzle, knowing that the moment he arrived, the true, multifaceted threat, terrestrial and otherwise, would converge upon their small, subterranean sanctuary. The minutes stretched into an agonizing expanse. Lena worked with a focused intensity that bordered on mania, her fingers flying across the interface, coaxing the encrypted data into a readable format. The small laboratory hub they had fashioned in the abandoned conduit hummed with barely contained energy. She felt a profound sense of responsibility for the data, the creature's energy output, its biological markers, the subtle patterns in its cloaking field. All were now compressed into lines of code that could fundamentally rewrite fields from astrophysics to xenobiology. She was no longer merely validating her theories. She was writing the first chapter of human contact preparedness. Jax remained rigid at his post. He could hear the desert wind shifting high above them, the subtle creaks of the stressed structure settling under the morning heat. His senses, trained to filter white noise, were now focused on minute variations, the distant rumble of an engine that didn't sound like Mac's heavy transport, the faint sharp smell of burning hydrocarbons that suggested a vehicle stopping too quickly nearby. He knew the government cleanup teams wouldn't use recognizable official vehicles. They would utilize proxies, unmarked SUVs that blended into the backdrop of rural infrastructure, driven by men who moved with a practiced, unnerving efficiency that Jax knew intimately. The expected arrival time for Professor Reed passed silently. A cold knot formed in Jax's stomach. Reed, brilliant but notoriously cautious, would not be late unless he was either stopped or delayed by overwhelming factors. "He's not coming," Jax murmured, his voice barely audible over the hum of the electronics. "Silas must have flagged a tail, or they intercepted his communications." Lena's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear that transcended the academic. "Intercepted? But I used the highest grade burst encryption available to send the rendezvous request to his private satellite phone. He wouldn't have responded if he saw a trace." "That assumes they are looking for you," Jax corrected, pushing off the wall and moving toward her, his posture shifting from sentinel to tactical planner. "If the drone picked up a radiation spike, they aren't looking for a scientist. They're looking for an unregistered power source. The thing you built to turn off the cloak. They're coming for the hardware, Lena, and Reed was the bait." The realization hit Lena with the force of a physical blow. She hadn't just invited danger. She had provided the enemy with a clean vector to intercept key personnel. Her scientific obsession had blinded her to the operational realities of military containment. "We have to send a warning. If Reed left his campus—" "Too late for warnings," Jax cut in sharply. He knelt beside her, placing a hand firmly on the hard drive casing. "We initiate Plan B. Extraction is compromised. We move deeper into the conduit structure. You start downloading the raw data. Everything. Onto this secondary, disposable drive." He handed her a small, nondescript memory stick, older technology, deliberately simple to avoid modern forensic analysis. "The main unit stays here. If they breach this chamber, they find your research, but they don't find the key." Before Lena could argue about abandoning the primary evidence, the sound came from above. Not the creak of settling earth, but the metallic shriek of heavy drilling cutting through concrete near the main access hatch. They were already here. Jax didn't waste time on further explanation. He grabbed the heavy-duty containment unit holding the plasma caster components. "Go. I buy you 5 minutes. Find a secondary access shaft labeled Ventilation Bypass 4A. I'll meet you there, or I'll seal the primary route." He pushed her toward the dark, narrow passage leading away from the hub, a finality in his movement that suggested he expected this to be a one-way trip for himself. As Lena scrambled into the tight space, clutching the disposable drive, she looked back. Jax had already deployed a series of small-shaped charges against the remaining structural supports around the main hatch, planting them with the practiced ease of a demolition expert. He was turning their sanctuary into a tomb, preparing to face the encroaching terrestrial threat with the same lethal resolve he had shown the alien hunter. The final silence of the conduit was about to be shattered by the sound of men fighting men over the secrets of the stars. The stark sun-bleached expanse of the Badlands in the 2025 iteration of the Predator narrative offers a potent visual metaphor for the isolation and moral decay that underpin this entry. Unlike the lush, claustrophobic jungles of the original, this setting immediately shifts the tone from pure survival horror to a more existential dread, suggesting that the hunt can take root anywhere civilization's tenuous grip begins to fray. This iteration seems less concerned with the military precision of Arnold Schwarzenegger's Dutch Schaefer, and more focused on the contemporary anxieties surrounding marginalized communities and resource scarcity, themes that resonate deeply with modern cinematic sensibilities. The protagonist, whose background is rooted in deep space salvage operations, a nod perhaps to the disillusionment felt by many blue-collar workers facing automation, reminiscent of the working-class grit often portrayed in films starring actors who embody that grounded physicality, finds themselves in a territory governed not by law, but by the dictates of the predator. This narrative choice skillfully avoids simply rehashing old tropes. Instead, it positions the creature as an almost mythological force, capitalizing on existing societal breakdown. The tension doesn't just stem from the cloaking technology. It arises from the realization that the alien merely exploits weaknesses already present in the human infrastructure. One compelling aspect is the deliberate choice of weaponry and tactics employed by the human survivors. We see a departure from heavy artillery toward improvised traps and environmental manipulation, echoing the guerrilla warfare tactics honed by characters in early 2000s action thrillers, where resourcefulness trumped firepower. This shift reflects an evolution in cinematic thinking about how one fights an apex predator, not with matching force, but with superior intelligence applied to a familiar landscape. The antagonist predator itself, rumored to utilize highly specialized thermal masking optimized for arid environments rather than tropical humidity, presents a fascinating technical challenge, forcing the audience to adjust their established visual lexicon of the creature's weaknesses. The film draws heavily on the visual language of Westerns, an interesting parallel given that the Predator franchise has always flirted with the concept of the ultimate outsider hunting established territory. Where the original was a Vietnam allegory, this version seems to channel the distrust and territoriality inherent in the American frontier narrative. The director, whose previous work explored themes of post-apocalyptic resource wars with a keen eye for character-driven desperation, seems intent on grounding the spectacle in believable human desperation. The performance of the lead actor, known for his nuanced portrayal of characters teetering on the edge of ethical collapse in prestige television dramas, lends a necessary weight to the increasingly desperate choices made under sustained, invisible duress. Furthermore, the handling of the predator's motivations appears more ambiguous than in prior installments. If the film leans into the idea that this particular species is not simply collecting trophies, but perhaps is culling populations deemed unworthy or diseased based on their environmental impact or social dysfunction, a dark twist on the honor code established in earlier movies, it elevates the narrative beyond simple hunting. It becomes a commentary on species-level judgment. The very fact that the Badlands environment is already scarred and polluted suggests the audience is watching a second-tier hunt, one where the prize is less the warrior and more the last remnants of viable life struggling in a broken world. This focus on the aftermath, rather than the pristine wilderness, is perhaps the most significant thematic departure, suggesting that in 2025, the real monster might be the environment we've already created for ourselves, with the alien merely acting as the final, undeniable proof of our failure. The portrayal of the human element suffering under this relentless pressure is where the film truly finds its ragged heart. The survivors are not hardened commandos. They are described in leaked production notes as individuals who have already lost much to the harshness of the Badlands long before the Yautja arrives. There's a palpable sense of fatigue woven into their movements, a weariness that transcends fear and settles into a deep-seated fatalism. One character, a former emergency medical technician, whose career ended after a catastrophic supply chain failure, left her rural clinic abandoned, carries a desperate, almost maternal protectiveness over the younger members of the group. Her expertise manifests not in tactical planning, but in meticulous rationing and treating wounds inflicted by dust storms as much as by alien weaponry, drawing a stark parallel between human-made neglect and extraterrestrial predation. The emotional landscape is deliberately muted, reflecting a populace accustomed to low-grade catastrophe. Joy is a fleeting, almost dangerous luxury. When moments of dark humor surface, they are brittle, used as shields rather than genuine expressions of levity. This contrasts sharply with the explosive bravado often seen in 80s action heroes. Here, resilience is quiet, expressed through the stubborn maintenance of small routines, cleaning scavenged tools, sharing meager water rations, acts that defy the chaos rather than actively fighting it on a grand scale. The script seems to understand that true terror in a contemporary setting often isn't the sudden shock, but the endless, grinding attrition of hope. The sound design plays a critical role in amplifying this psychological torture. The absence of sound in the wide, empty spaces becomes as menacing as any alien shriek. When the predator does make noise, it's often a highly localized, almost polite acoustic interference, a faint static hiss near a piece of rusted metal, or the subtle, unnerving click that indicates the creature is calculating kinetic energy differentials nearby. This meticulous soundscape forces the audience, alongside the characters, to constantly recalibrate their senses, second-guessing every flicker of heat haze or shift in the dry earth. Moreover, the film hints at a deeper lore connected to the Badlands' history, suggesting that this desolate area might have been a testing ground or a graveyard for failed previous hunts. This imbues the setting with a spectral quality. The humans are not just hiding from the present threat, but are unknowingly traversing layers of past violence. The visual evidence of this, faintly etched symbols on canyon walls that resemble skeletal remains fused with advanced alien composite materials, offers tantalizing crumbs for the audience, appealing to the connoisseur of franchise continuity while remaining unobtrusive to the immediate survival plot. It suggests a cyclical, perhaps eternal, conflict played out on the desolate stage of human overreach. The film doesn't offer redemption, it offers endurance, a grim testament to the ability of life, however diminished, to persist even when the hunters from the stars have deemed the territory exhausted. The emotional resonance of Predator Badlands 2025 is further deepened by examining the motivations of the supporting cast, individuals whose personal histories mirror the environmental devastation surrounding them. Consider the character often serving as the group's reluctant scout, a former infrastructure engineer whose expertise in mapping underground water tables becomes tragically ironic given the current drought. His defining characteristic is a near-pathological need for control over his immediate surroundings, a compulsive checking of rudimentary tripwires, a minute-by-minute accounting of remaining fuel cells. This control is his psychological armor against the universe's chaotic indifference, a mirror of the over-reliance on brittle, complex systems that led to the region's collapse in the first place. When the predator systematically dismantles one of his meticulously planned traps, the resulting breakdown isn't a shout of rage, but a terrifying silent descent into catatonia, illustrating that for this generation, the loss of order is a fate worse than death. The film wisely avoids giving the predator any discernible human-like villainy. Instead, its sheer alien efficiency becomes the source of dread. We observe the creature not through grand confrontations, but through the horrifying aftermath of its swift surgical strikes. A scene involving the creature's utilization of environmental camouflage, perhaps employing heat-absorbing minerals or dust clouds naturally occurring in the terrain to augment its cloaking field, is executed with breathtaking subtlety. It moves less like a hunter and more like a geological event, something inevitable and impersonal. This lack of recognizable malice strips the humans of the comfort of hatred. They cannot rail against a force they cannot comprehend or assign human flaws to. The directorial gaze frequently lingers on objects left behind. A child's rusted tricycle half buried in sand, the the faded logo of a defunct solar energy corporation on a derelict water tower. These objects serve as quiet emotional anchors, grounding the existential threat in concrete evidence of what has been lost, the promise of a future that withered prematurely. The cinematography emphasizes the vastness of the sky against the small, desperate figures below, employing long lenses that compress the landscape, making the distance between safety and oblivion seem terrifyingly short. This aesthetic choice reinforces the feeling that escape is not a matter of distance traveled, but of luck finally running out. In terms of character dynamics, the film eschews typical military hierarchy for a loose, familial structure forged by shared trauma. The unspoken leadership often falls to the individual most capable of suppressing their own panic, a trait which the engineer and the EMT embody differently. Their tension arises not from personality clashes, but from differing philosophies on survival. The engineer believes in engineering a solution, a permanent way out, while the EMT believes only in maximizing the next 24 hours. Their conflict is the microcosm of humanity's failure, the inability to agree on long-term strategy when immediate survival demands all focus. This grounding in deeply felt, flawed human reactions prevents the film from devolving into a mere showcase for creature effects, ensuring that when the inevitable confrontation arrives, the audience is invested not in who survives, but in the manner of their final, desperate resistance against the ultimate external judgment. The narrative structure itself seems to mirror the desolate setting, employing a deliberately slow burn that frustrates the audience's ingrained expectation for immediate action sequences, common in modern tentpole features. This pacing choice forces sustained engagement with the psychological toll. We see moments where the humans, having observed patterns in the predator's movements, perhaps noticing a preference for tracking prey during the brief, intense dust storms that sweep through the Badlands, attempt to use these environmental anomalies as cover. However, the film cleverly subverts this perceived advantage. One sequence depicts the group successfully hiding within the thickest part of a dust squall, only for the audience to realize that the creature is not tracking them via thermal signature, but through minute seismic vibrations caused by their breathing or subtle shifting of weight on the unstable ground. This suggests a technological evolution in the yautja hunting apparatus, far exceeding previous on-screen depictions, moving beyond sight and heat into a realm of almost geophysical awareness. The inclusion of a character who seems to be actively seeking the predator, rather than merely fleeing it, adds a necessary layer of dangerous obsession. This individual, perhaps a former fringe scientist or conspiracy theorist whose life's work was ridiculed before the arrival, views the creature not as a mere threat, but as validation. His motivation isn't survival, it's comprehension and documentation, a desperate attempt to impose academic order onto chaos. He carries archaic recording equipment alongside jury-rigged Geiger counters, trying to measure the alien's exotic radiation signature. His eventual fate is tragically ironic. He successfully locates the creature's nesting or resting area, only to be killed not by a direct attack, but by accidental self-sabotage stemming from an overly complex data collection apparatus malfunctioning under pressure. His death serves as a grim warning against intellectual hubris, suggesting that in the face of true apex predation, theoretical understanding offers no shield. The film often frames the landscape itself as the predator's most effective ally. The deep, convoluted canyons and dry riverbeds offer natural ambush points, but also create acoustic traps where the slightest sound carries for miles. The crew spends significant screen time navigating these perilous pathways, their movements dictated entirely by the shadow lines cast by the midday sun, forced to move only when the heat haze is thickest and visual acuity is lowest for human eyes. This reliance on geological structure over man-made fortifications highlights the regression of human technology against instinctual, nature-honed alien superiority. The audience watches them crawl through narrow passes, their bodies pressed against rock faces that feel more like prison bars than shelter, experiencing the environment as a constraint imposed by the invisible hunter. The Badlands, therefore, are not just a backdrop. They are the predator's primary weapon system, meticulously weaponized by its very presence. The final act's descent into raw, unmediated terror hinges on the dwindling resources and the resulting collapse of communal trust, a psychological pressure cooker that the director handles with chilling precision. As water supplies drop to critically low levels, the moral ambiguities that plagued the early narrative sharpen into stark, survivalist choices. The former engineer, driven to the edge by his inability to control the environment, begins hoarding water purification tablets, a small act of betrayal that fractures the fragile alliance. This shift is portrayed not with dramatic confrontation, but through subtle shifts in body language, a refusal to meet eyes during rationing, an extra second spent guarding a canteen. It's the quiet death of shared humanity under duress, far more disturbing than any physical confrontation with the yautja. The predator, sensing this internal decay, escalates its psychological warfare. Instead of immediate attacks, it begins leaving tokens, not trophies in the traditional sense, but carefully positioned remnants of past victims that directly contradict the survivors' meager resources. For instance, near the engineer's hidden stash of tablets, the creature leaves a perfectly preserved, completely desiccated human larynx, suggesting the futility of hoarding something as basic as breath. This suggests a predator that has learned to exploit the very concept of scarcity, turning the human's need against itself. The performance of the actress portraying the EMT becomes central here. Her innate practical focus on immediate physical well-being clashes violently with the engineer's abstract systemic hoarding, forcing her to make a brutally pragmatic choice that prioritizes the group's immediate survival over moral purity. The climactic confrontation, when it finally occurs, takes place not during a glorious sunset, but in the suffocating blackness of a forgotten collapsed mining shaft, a location chosen for its complete nullification of the predator's advanced environmental tracking. Or so the humans desperately hope. The darkness strips the creature of its technological superiority, reducing the fight to brute force and momentary luck. Even here, the film resists the urge for a clean victory. The final human survivor, severely wounded, manages to cripple the creature using the one resource the predator failed to account for: the unstable geology of the mine itself. The resulting collapse is messy, organic, and final for both combatants, emphasizing that victory in this desolate theater is achieved not through superior armament or cunning traps, but through sheer, desperate proximity to collapse. The lingering shot is not of a triumphant survivor, but of the dust settling on an unrecognizable, crushed mass of organic and alien material. A final, bleak portrait of exhaustion defining existence in the Badlands. The ultimate silence following the mine collapse is the film's most profound statement, a deliberate avoidance of the cathartic roar often associated with franchise finales. It speaks volumes about the cost of mere persistence. The lone survivor, unnamed in any official capacity, is shown minutes later, not celebrating, but exhibiting the deep-seated physical trauma endemic to everyone else in the film, a pronounced limp, shallow, ragged breathing that echoes the EMT's earlier attempts to conserve air. This is not a character poised for sequels or heroism. This is a testament to grim endurance. The experience has not forged a hero, but rather refined a survivor down to its barest, most damaged essence. The victory is entirely Pyrrhic. The environment remains hostile, and the psychological scars are permanent, etched deeper than any plasma burn. This theme of internalized scarring is subtly reinforced through the film's use of lingering close-ups on the hands of the characters. We see hands cracked and bleeding from handling abrasive desert flora, hands trembling not just from fear, but from severe dehydration. And finally, the survivor's hands covered in pulverized rock and alien gore, yet still instinctively seeking something to clean or repair, the futile gesture of a professional trained to fix things in a world that is fundamentally broken. This focus anchors the epic conflict in the intensely personal, relatable struggle against physical decay. The lingering emotional residue of the narrative suggests that the true terror inflicted by the predator in this setting is the forced erasure of human interdependence. When the dust settles, the survivor is entirely alone, emphasizing that the community, forged in shared desperation, was ultimately unsustainable when faced with the absolute scarcity imposed by the hunter. The film posits that in a truly harsh environment, the societal structures we rely upon are the first to cannibalize themselves before the alien even needs to intervene directly. The Badlands, already stripped bare by human folly, merely provided the perfect crucible for this final, internal breakdown. Predator Badlands 2025 thus operates as a devastating critique, using the alien threat as the catalyst to reveal the terminal fragility of contemporary human society when stripped of its comforts and illusions of control. The film's refusal to offer a clear narrative path for the lone survivor solidifies its bleak vision. There is no suggestion of rescue helicopters or distant civilization beckoning. Instead, the final moments lean into the ambiguity of the horizon. The survivor, now a ghost moving through a landscape that has consumed everyone they knew, walks toward the setting sun, a visual motif often used to signal finality or doom in westerns, suggesting a pilgrimage toward an unknown, almost inevitable second confrontation, or simply the cessation of movement altogether. The camera lingers on the texture of the irradiated earth, emphasizing that even if the Yautja threat were somehow neutralized, the Badlands themselves remain an active antagonist, an ongoing judgment on human habitation. Furthermore, the visual depiction of the predator in its final moments, particularly if it sustained severe damage, reveals a fascinating divergence from established lore. If its biomask is cracked, or its sophisticated camouflage system fails due to the mine's collapsing integrity, the audience sees not just a wounded beast, but an alien entity whose very biology seems ill-suited for the terrestrial desolation it chose to hunt in. Patches of its usually iridescent, chitinous armor appear dull, perhaps scorched by seismic heat, or reacting negatively to the specific mineral composition of the underground chamber. This subtle vulnerability humanizes the creature just enough to make its previous efficiency more terrifying. It was operating far outside its optimum parameters, yet still nearly succeeded. The inspiration drawn from the career trajectories of actors who specialize in portraying characters under immense, prolonged stress, individuals whose screen presence conveys a lifetime of disappointment before the first line is spoken, is evident in the pacing of the emotional exhaustion. There are no sudden bursts of manic energy, only slow, grinding adjustments to catastrophic reality. This style requires an audience accustomed to rapid-fire pacing to lean in, to listen to the silence and observe the infinitesimal shifts in posture that betray a character's internal state. It is a film built for analysts of human psychology rather than adrenaline junkies. The inspiration taken from films that explore deep-seated resource wars, where the fight for a gallon of clean water eclipses ideological differences, clearly informs the script's construction of the final human conflict. The betrayal over water tablets is more emotionally devastating than any spear thrust because it confirms the inherent selfishness lurking beneath the veneer of their temporary camaraderie. In Predator Badlands 2025, survival is the ultimate solvent, dissolving every bond that isn't purely biological necessity, leaving behind only the irreducible core of self-preservation. The thematic weight of environmental degradation is perhaps the most persistently understated element driving the horror. The film subtly implies that the Badlands were already a zone of ecological collapse long before the predator's arrival, suggesting the Yautja are drawn to these areas not for the challenge of the hunt alone, but perhaps for the very toxicity or spiritual deadness that permeates the region. One recurring motif involves the human characters having to sift through layers of industrial refuse, rusted barrels leaking unidentifiable sludge, massive skeletal frameworks of long-dead mining equipment, to find potable water or salvageable metal. This forced interaction with the remnants of human industrial greed paints the Yautja as a final, inevitable consequence of a broken relationship with the planet. The film avoids outright didacticism, yet the visual evidence is overwhelming. Humanity has already executed a self-inflicted extinction event. The predator is merely the cleanup crew. This ecological reading extends even to the design of the film's ancillary technology. The few working vehicles or electronic devices scavenged by the survivors are perpetually malfunctioning, their batteries draining too quickly, their signals distorted by atmospheric interference caused by residual subterranean radiation. This constant technological failure mirrors the failure of centralized society. Contrast this with the predator's technology, which even when partially damaged, retains an eerie, almost organic resilience. When its thermal vision flickers, it doesn't just shut down. It switches modes, perhaps revealing a hitherto unseen form of detection based on barometric pressure or airborne particulates, demonstrating that the alien technology is deeply integrated with and adaptable to the harsh environment that defeated human engineering. The emotional core of the film shifts in its closing sequences to focus on memory and loss, viewed through the lens of extreme sensory deprivation. The protagonist, having survived the mine collapse, begins to exhibit symptoms akin to post-traumatic stress disorder that manifest visually through auditory hallucinations. Brief, distorted echoes of conversations with the fallen comrades, or phantom sounds of machinery that no longer exists. These moments are shot in extreme close-up, isolating the survivor's face against a background of overwhelming negative space, underscoring the idea that the true wilderness the humans could not conquer was the interior landscape of their own minds, fractured by isolation and unresolved grief. The film suggests that even if the alien threat vanishes, the landscape of the self remains forever scarred by its passage. The final image, if the survivor is indeed walking toward the horizon, is not one of escape, but of perpetual motion without destination. A human existence reduced to the minimum necessary expenditure of energy to avoid immediate extinction. A silent, agonizing parody of life itself. The narrative's commitment to this desolate realism is further cemented by its sparing, almost reluctant, use of the creature's defining visual elements. For long stretches, the predator remains entirely unseen, its presence marked only by the physics of its impact. A snapped tree trunk that required impossible leverage, a perfectly circular scorch mark on sun-baked clay, or the sudden, unnerving silence of desert wildlife. When the creature finally reveals its full form in the mine, it is bathed in the flickering, unreliable light of a single scavenged chemical flare, deliberately obscuring the clean, high-contrast look of earlier films. This visual decision forces the audience to rely on auditory and kinetic cues, emphasizing texture and movement over clarity, much like the human characters who have had to discard visual acuity in favor of listening to the ground beneath their feet. The inspiration for this grounded portrayal likely stems from directors known for emphasizing world-building over spectacle, where the environment acts as a co-star. The character arcs, particularly the slow erosion of the engineer's rationality, mirror the narrative pacing of survival dramas where internal conflict outweighs external threats. His final moments, where he attempts to repair a broken piece of equipment, even as the structure collapses around him, are a direct commentary on the obsolete nature of his skill set, the misplaced faith in complex systems in a simplified, deadly reality. He dies clinging to the tools of the civilization that failed him. Moreover, the film hints at a recurring, almost ritualistic aspect to the predator's hunting pattern in this locale. Scattered throughout the Badlands are crude cairns, not trophies, but perhaps navigational markers or boundaries recognized by the Yautja. These stone piles, constructed with an unnerving uniformity that defies wind or erosion, suggest a longevity to the creature's presence that spans generations of human failure. The survivors occasionally mistake these cairns for safe resting spots, only to find they have inadvertently entered a pre-marked kill zone. This subtly transforms the predator from an opportunistic alien hunter into a territorial warden, one whose jurisdiction over the barren lands is ancient and unchallenged. The film leaves the audience with the chilling understanding that in the Badlands, humans are not just prey. They are trespassers on an established hunting preserve, and the rules of engagement were set long before the first landing craft ever touched down. The film's underlying emotional current is one of deep, almost genetic fatigue, a sense that humanity in this environment is simply running out of energy to fight entropy itself. This is most acutely felt in the depiction of the survivors' nonverbal communication. With dialogue sparse and often utilitarian, meaning is conveyed through the weight of their shared glances, the speed with which they turn away from one another, or the deliberate slowness of their movements to conserve caloric expenditure. This physical language suggests a collective agreement, born from repeated trauma, that expending energy on unnecessary emotional displays is a luxury they cannot afford. The former EMT, for instance, rarely cries. Instead, her despair manifests as an almost paralyzing stillness when she is alone, a physical manifestation of having already given everything she possesses. This subdued emotional palette directly contrasts with the visceral, almost operatic nature of the predator's threat. When the creature finally engages, the violence is swift, brutal, and almost entirely devoid of the predator's typical elaborate displays of dominance. The lack of roaring or prolonged stalking in the final confrontation suggests that this particular yautja recognizes the low value of its prey. There is no need for showmanship when the victim is already so diminished by their surroundings. The film frames this encounter as less a duel and more an execution carried out by a highly specialized environmental cleaner. The director's subtle commentary on inherited guilt is woven into the background visual tapestry. In abandoned settlements, the camera often focuses on the children's toys or school blackboards, covered not in dust, but in the fine red grit of the Badlands, subtly suggesting that the current generation was born into a ruined inheritance. The few moments of genuine human connection, sharing a sip of purified water, covering a friend during a sandstorm, feel profoundly heavy, because the audience knows these moments are statistical anomalies, temporary aberrations from the inexorable trend toward solitude and self-preservation. Furthermore, the film explores the concept of acquired camouflage. The survivors, through sheer necessity, begin to adopt the behaviors of desert scavengers. They move at dawn and dusk, they utilize natural windbreaks, and they learn to read the slightest anomalies in the heat signature of the rocks to gauge what might be near. This learned mimicry, while essential for survival, further erodes their connection to their former identities. They are becoming part of the landscape that is trying to kill them, blurring the line between prey and environmental hazard, making their eventual elimination feel less like a hunt and more like the natural culling of a maladapted species. The final narrative effect is one of profound, intellectual horror, suggesting that the most inescapable trap is the reality we build for ourselves, which the predator merely steps into and exploits. The persistent motif of broken technology serves as a constant, low-frequency scream throughout the narrative, emphasizing the technological chasm separating the human survivors from their relentless hunter. The salvaged communications gear, designed for long-range, high-fidelity transmission, now only manages to produce grating static or bursts of unintelligible white noise, symbolizing the shattering of global connectivity. This impotence is contrasted sharply with the predator's technology, which seems to be powered by sources immune to the pervasive electromagnetic interference and mineral saturation of the Badlands. When the survivor does manage to activate a piece of salvaged equipment, perhaps a thermal scanner meant for geological survey, it often provides a completely misleading reading, showing the environment as uniformly hot due to the ambient desert temperatures, effectively blinding them to the creature's localized, subtle heat signature. This technological sabotage isn't overt. It's the insidious failure of systems designed for a different, more predictable world. The director seems to draw inspiration from slow-burn psychological thrillers where paranoia, rather than action, dictates the plot progression. The film often employs handheld camera work when following the survivors, mirroring their jittery, unpredictable movements. yet switches to an impossibly stable, distant perspective, almost like a drone or satellite view, when showing the predator's movements, suggesting an objective, omniscient surveillance that the humans can never escape. This visual dichotomy reinforces the power imbalance. The humans are trapped in their subjective, immediate reality of fear, while the predator operates with detached, objective efficiency, treating the entire region as a laboratory. The film subtly reinterprets the alien's trophy concept for this arid setting. Instead of clean skulls, the predator appears to be collecting samples of highly resilient, unique extremophile bacteria or mineral formations found only in the deepest, most untouched parts of the canyons. Evidence that the Yautja are studying the planet's biological resilience in the face of catastrophe, viewing the human struggle as merely an irrelevant side effect of the environmental decline they find interesting. This implies a higher, scientific interest rather than mere sport, making the humans feel even less significant. The former scientist character's obsession with recording the predator's presence now seems even more misguided. He sought validation, while the creature was simply cataloging environmental data points, rendering his life's work utterly meaningless in the grand scheme of the alien's research. Ultimately, Predator Badlands 2025 functions as a devastating parable about redundancy. The survivors are redundant because their advanced knowledge is useless in a simplified, brutal ecosystem. Their community is redundant because scarcity forces a return to base self-interest. Even the predator's hunt seems almost perfunctory, an exercise in confirming known data points about a degraded ecosystem. The final, grueling walk into the sunset is not the beginning of a new adventure, but the slow, agonizing confirmation of the narrative's central thesis: that sometimes the environment, coupled with our own failings, is a more effective predator than any alien entity could ever be. The film's deliberate focus on the materiality of suffering extends to the visceral depiction of wounds and environmental exposure. The EMT's meticulous care is often a fight against the desert itself. Close-ups reveal skin not just lacerated by plasma fire, but perpetually inflamed by abrasive silica dust, leading to deep infected fissures that antibiotics scavenged from defunct pharmacies cannot fully heal. These non-alien wounds fester with a slow, inevitable rot, a constant, nagging reminder that even if the Yautja vanished, the Badlands would claim them through slower means. The visual palette reinforces this. Even the scant moisture present, a few precious drops of treated water, looks thick, almost viscous, stained brown by the iron-rich earth, signifying that purity is a concept belonging to a lost world. The character dynamics surrounding this scarcity reach a tragic climax not in the act of betrayal, but in the immediate aftermath of the engineer's hoarding being exposed. When the EMT confronts him, it's not with anger, but a profound, weary disappointment that seems to drain the very color from the scene. Her subsequent decision to enforce rationing, perhaps by physically taking the excess water tablets, is carried out with the detached professionalism of someone performing necessary triage on a dying patient. There is no moral victory, only a reduction of options. This scene is deliberately framed to show the engineer's reaction, a sudden, horrifying clarity replacing his paranoia, realizing that his attempt to control the future cost him his only immediate support structure. He doesn't fight back. He simply sinks onto the sand, defeated not by the alien, but by the breakdown of the social contract he relied upon. The sound design, having previously emphasized subtle acoustic cues, introduces a chilling element tied to the predator's waste products. After one of its attacks, perhaps a failed kinetic blast that merely vaporized part of the terrain, a high-pitched, almost chemical odor is detected by the survivors, a smell that causes immediate nausea and disorientation. This suggests the creature's weaponry leaves behind byproducts that are toxic to the local biome, acting as a form of environmental contamination warfare. The survivors' attempts to mask this chemical signature using burning scraps of decayed plastic or rubber only makes the air heavier, further poisoning their limited breathing space. It becomes clear the predator is not just hunting. It is terraforming the kill zone into something less hospitable to human biology, forcing them to actively poison themselves to escape detection. In the finale, the survivors' crawl out of the collapsed mine shaft is less an ascent toward freedom and more a slow, painful re-entry into a hostile stage. The camera focuses on the survivors' eyes, no longer sharp with alertness, but glazed with shock and tunnel vision. The lingering shot of the horizon, as previously mentioned, is ultimately contrasted with a sudden, brief auditory phenomenon. A sound that is neither human nor yautja. A distant, low-frequency thrumming, perhaps indicating another geological shift, or possibly the arrival of another unknown entity, attracted by the explosive energies of the mine collapse. This ambiguity ensures that the film ends not on a note of resolution, but on the chilling realization that even if the immediate threat is gone, the Badlands are a nexus of persistent, escalating dangers, and the survivor is simply unprepared for the next act in this eternal, desolate drama. The film's final, unsettling ambiguity, that low-frequency thrumming against the vast silence, suggests the Badlands are less a localized disaster zone and more a planetary symptom. This thrum is treated by the sound designers not as a conventional noise, but as a physical pressure felt in the chest cavity of the audience, hinting at tectonic, or perhaps even extraterrestrial mechanisms operating beneath the surface that dwarf the scale of the predator's visitation. It implies that the yautja were merely opportunistic visitors drawn to the region's already unstable magnetic or geological narrative, not the primary agents of its desolation. This elevates the horror from a monster movie scenario to a cosmic confrontation with a deeply flawed planet. The survivors' glazed eyes and tunnel vision are further interpreted through the film's use of selective focus. As they move, the foreground, the grit underfoot, the immediate danger, is razor-sharp, while the distant horizon, the symbolic escape route, dissolves into a meaningless, shimmering blur. This directorial choice externalizes the psychological condition. The brain, overwhelmed by trauma, has ceased processing long-term goals, restricting all perception to the next agonizing footstep. The character is no longer surviving to reach a destination. They are merely continuing, because stopping means instantaneous death. Visually, the chemical flare that illuminated the final battle in the mine is shown briefly again, perhaps reflected faintly off the survivors' scorched canteen hours later. In that brief, sickening yellow-orange light, the audience can almost make out faint, intricate scarring on the survivor's skin, not from the creature's claws, but from exposure to the Badlands' own toxic legacy, perhaps chemical burns from the water they drank or the dust they breathed. This suggests the yautja's final act was not just killing its prey, but inadvertently forcing the humans to confront the deeper, slower poison they were already ingesting. The predator, in its destructive pursuit, accidentally provided the illumination necessary for the survivor to see the true nature of their long-term affliction. The emotional arc concludes with the survivor instinctively engaging in a final, futile act of order, tracing a pattern in the sand with a broken finger, perhaps the schematic of a water purification system or the layout of a forgotten city grid. It is the final assertion of the engineer's ghost within them, an echo of the need to impose structure on meaninglessness. As the survivor resumes their stumbling walk toward the indistinguishable horizon, the camera pulls back slowly, higher and higher, until the lone figure is swallowed entirely by the overwhelming, indifferent canvas of the rust-colored wasteland. The final title card, if one appears, is deliberately placed over the image of empty sky, leaving the audience with the profound, unresolved dread that the true nightmare in Predator Badlands 2025 is the quiet persistence of a world determined to forget humanity ever existed. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Q-Man channel. If you are new here, please consider subscribing and hitting that like button. Today, we are going to be discussing the film Predator Badlands 2025. The desert sun beat down with a relentless fury, mirroring the tension gripping the small, disparate group hunkered near the rusting remains of some forgotten industrial complex. This desolate stretch, far from any recognized jurisdiction, had become an unwilling arena. Our protagonist, Jax, a former Delta Force operative whose career had ended less with a bang and more with a classified career-ending incident in the South China Sea, now scraped by running high-risk security details. He possessed the weary competence of a man who had seen too much and cared too little, yet his instincts remained razor-sharp, honed by years under pressure. Opposite him stood Dr. Lena Hansen, an astrobiologist whose quiet intensity belied her radical theories about exoplanetary biology. Lena wasn't seeking fame. Her driving force was the validation of her unconventional research, often dismissed by mainstream science, research that had led her, perhaps foolishly, to track anomalous energy signatures deep into this forbidden territory. Her quiet presence was a stark contrast to the muscle Jax brought to the team. The catalyst for their current misery arrived not in tanks or infantry, but with chilling stealth. The creature, a predator, or yautja as Lena tentatively whispered, was less a brute and more a phantom hunter. It moved through the scrubland with an unnerving grace, its camouflage rendering it almost invisible against the heat haze. This wasn't the lumbering beast of early encounters. This iteration seemed faster, smarter, employing tactics that suggested a profound understanding of its prey's psychology. Jax immediately